Most Americans know only one version of the Thanksgiving story. The Pilgrims sailed to the New World and landed at Plymouth Rock, where they struggled to learn how to survive in a land different from their own. Luckily, kind-hearted Native Americans showed them how to grow corn and helped them form alliances with neighboring tribes. With the help of the Native Americans like Squanto, the Pilgrims learned to live in the New World, and they celebrate with a Thanksgiving Day feast that they share with their new Native American friends. And ever since, Americans continued to celebrate that version of the story on the fourth Thursday of November as a national holiday. But turns out, that version of the Thanksgiving story was nothing more than a story. So how about this holiday season, we debunk some Thanksgiving myths and spill some facts along with that gravy. The Pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock. According to historian George Willison, who devoted his life to the subject, the story of the rock was nothing more than a joke, a public relations ploy played by the townspeople to attract attention. What Willison discovered was that the legend of Plymouth Rock was based entirely on the questionable testimony of Thomas Faunce, a 95-year-old man who told the story more than a century after the Mayflower landing. Unfortunately, very few people know the story of Plymouth Rock. Willison's book came out at the end of World War II, and Americans were more thoughtful than the Pilgrims, so we all happily continued to repeat the same old story as if it were true, but it wasn't. And anyway, the Pilgrims didn't land at Plymouth first. They first landed in Provincetown. Of course, the people of Plymouth still maintain long-standing traditions. Pilgrims, Puritans, the same thing. Although even presidents get it wrong, Ronald Reagan once called Puritan John Winthrop a pilgrim, but Pilgrims and Puritans are two different groups. The Pilgrims arrived on the Mayflower and lived in Plymouth. The Puritans arrived a decade later and settled in Boston. The Pilgrims were famous for their religious lifestyle, but they didn't come to America to escape religious persecution as some people claim. In fact, they did so when they left England and settled in Leiden, Netherlands in the early 17th century. They then decided to leave the Netherlands, where they enjoyed religious freedom but struggled to make a living. Some people also feared losing their English identity to the Dutch. On the other hand, the Puritans came to America only in search of religious freedom. Confusing the Pilgrims and the Puritans would have appalled both. The Puritans viewed the Pilgrims as incurable. The Puritans hoped that the church would reform. While both shared the belief that the Church of England had become corrupt, only the Pilgrims believed it was beyond repair. So they chose the path of secession. The Pilgrims were kind to the Native Americans. The so-called Pilgrims were completely unprepared for life in New England, so they compensated by plundering the graves and barns of the same Native American tribe, Wampanoags, who they turned for help. It wasn't really surprising that relations between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag deteriorated shortly after Thanksgiving, leading to the Pequot War. Pilgrims lived in log cabins and dressed in black. No Pilgrim ever lived in a log cabin. The log cabin did not appear in America until late in the 17th century, when it was introduced by Germans and Swedes. The very term log cabin cannot be found in print until the 1770s. Log cabins were virtually unknown in England at the time the Pilgrims arrived in America. So what kind of dwellings did the Pilgrims inhabit? The Pilgrims lived in wood clapboard houses made from sawed lumber, and they did not dress in black. They didn't wear those funny buckles, weird shoes, or black steeple hats. So where did we get the idea of the buckles? In the 19th century, when the popular image of the Pilgrims were formed, buckles served as a kind of emblem of quaintness. That's the reason illustrators gave Santa buckles. Even the blunderbuss with which Pilgrims are identified was a symbol of quaintness. The blunderbuss was mainly used to control crowds. It wasn't a hunting rifle, but it looks out of date and fits the Pilgrim stereotype. Pilgrims were also nice to Squanto. Tisquantum, who is often called Squanto in Thanksgiving stories, did a lot to help the Pilgrims, such as translating for them, helping them with trade, and teaching them how to grow corn. But what most children don't learn in history classes is that Tisquantum was captured by the British and sold into slavery in Spain. By the time he escaped and returned to the New World, his entire tribe had died of smallpox. The 1621 Thanksgiving was the first Thanksgiving. Even if it were Thanksgiving, it wouldn't be the first Thanksgiving in North America. First of all, many Native American tribes also held ceremonies for the purpose of Thanksgiving, and so did many other European settlers. In 1565, a group of Spaniards invited Timucua tribe to their Thanksgiving feast in St. Augustine, Florida. In 1598, another group of Spaniards held a Thanksgiving feast on the Rio Grande River. And in 1619, another Thanksgiving took place near Jamestown. So the feast of 1621 was not a day of veneration, it was more like a harvest festival. And 50 pilgrims and 19 Wampanoag people gathered and celebrated. In addition to eating a lot, they certainly had games, races, and shootouts. The Pilgrims invited the Native Americans to a big feast. Although there is historical evidence that a party was held in 1621, there was no evidence that Native Americans were invited. If Native Americans were present, historians believe it was because members of the Wampanoag tribe living nearby heard settlers firing warning shots toward the tribe, or because the Wampanoag chief was on a diplomatic visit. Pilgrims eat turkey. What did the Pilgrims eat at their Thanksgiving feast? They didn't have corn on the cob, apples, pears, potatoes, or even cranberries. No one knows whether they ate turkey or not, even if they used to eat it. The only food we know they had was deer. So how did we get the idea that you have to have turkey, cranberries, and the like for Thanksgiving? This is because the Victorians prepared Thanksgiving this way, and they're the ones who turned Thanksgiving into a national holiday, starting in 1863 when Lincoln issued the Presidential Thanksgiving Proclamation. Before Lincoln, Americans outside of New England generally didn't celebrate this holiday. Pilgrims only became an integral part of the celebration at the end of the 19th century. Until then, Thanksgiving was simply a day of Thanksgiving, not a day to remember the Pilgrims. Thanksgiving is a holiday that brings people together. This is perhaps the biggest Thanksgiving myth. America likes to remember Thanksgiving as a peaceful harvest celebration that brought two communities together. But the reality is, the relationship between the Wampanoags and the Pilgrims was tenuous, to say the least, and if they dined together, it may not have been intentional. What followed that dinner was several hundred years of violent colonization and oppression of indigenous people to what is now the United States, the effects of which are still visible today. What do you think? Comment down in the section below and don't forget to like and subscribe.